Hello, welcome to this week's 8.9 News discussion. I'm Finlo Costain. The Labour Party seem increasingly likely to be the winners of the next UK general election. While they may not gain a parliamentary majority, it is widely expected that they will be the largest party in Westminster and that Sir Keir Starmer will be the next Prime Minister. With this in mind, we're turning our attention to the Labour Party conference, which took place this week in Liverpool. What are Labour's plans for land use, trade and agriculture, from housing to farm payments, from HS2 to land use strategies, from renewable energy to net zero? Well, I'm joined by Phil Carson, the UK policy lead for the Nature Friendly Farming Network, and by Vicki, author of Rebugging the Planet, who until very recently was the head of sustainable farming at Costain, but who has already taken up her new role as the strategic lead on agriculture with the Wildlife Trusts. Welcome both. Now, you were each in Liverpool, inside the security cordon. Phil, what caught your attention?
Yeah, so big things was just the size and the scale of the conference this year. I think we had an attendance of 19,000 people, which is the largest, I think, in the history of the Labour Party. So yeah, bigger scale, really, really large kind of engagement with the sector and a range of different voices. And I suppose in terms of the framing, there was a real sense of kind of trying to portray confidence, preparedness for government, and a party with, I suppose, a credible policy platform across a range of different areas. And one of the key things that kind of stuck out for me, particularly, was the framing around net zero and I suppose Labour's positioning on that. So we've had lots of examples of rollbacks, the cost of net zero, the implications for society. And this was a very strong kind of rebuttal of that in terms of the benefits and the opportunities. And we saw within Keir's speech, there's 3 references to net zero, and it's all about it's fueling growth. It's all about it delivering prosperity. And I thought that was quite interesting. It's an opportunity that couldn't be passed up. And I think that translated across the party in a lot of the sessions that I attended anyway. We've just recently had a reshuffle within the party, and we have Steve Reid as new DEFRA Secretary of State, or Shadow Secretary of State, should I say. And that, translated through in terms of framing around climate, but also nature as well. And I thought he was consistent in terms of the message that nature underpins food production. It also underpins prosperity and economic growth as well. And that was quite key. So early days within his portfolio, but interesting to see that coming through as well.
Phil, I wonder if you could just speak up a little bit, because you're a little bit muffled, and so that would be helpful going forwards. But you would expect the Shadow DEFRA Secretary to say things that are, reasonably welcome for people to hear. What I'm wondering is, when you look at other issues, I mean, net zero is a good example. These cut through, and they are things that are talked about by the Shadow Chancellor, by the Shadow Leader, by other members of the Shadow Cabinet. Was there any mention of land use or agriculture that you were aware of from anybody other than the Shadow DEFRA Secretary?
There was, in terms of planning, and I suppose how we look at land and how we manage different priorities. So quite a few sessions that I attended, there was a real focus on planning reform and enabling smarter land use in that sense. Also within the climate sphere as well, Kerry McCarthy mentioned the role of the land use framework in delivering multiple different objectives all at the same time. So there is a bit of cut through. I think it could be clearer. I think that alignment between food, farming, nature, the agriculture side of things, and Labour's climate priorities could be a lot stronger.
And of course, Kerry McCarthy was Shadow DEFRA Secretary at one point. Maybe we need all of the Shadow Cabinet to take a turn at Shadow DEFRA so that we make sure it's properly on their agenda. Vicki, what were your key takeaways?
Well, I would agree with Phil on a lot of those. I think there was a very strong emphasis on net zero and climate in many of the events I saw. But I was inevitably disappointed not to have farming and nature-based farming in any way in Keir's speech. No, I don't think nature was mentioned, which is frustrating. But we had some great events, and we held an event, in fact, with Phil, Nature Friendly Farmers Network, with Daniel, who's the Shadow Minister for Farming, and he's good. He really gets it. Daniel Zeitner, very good, and he was making some strong statements about nature-based approach being essential, and the multifunctional nature of farming, and the cross-departmental nature that farm and food policy should have. Although he's very clear that it's going to be difficult. That's not how government works really well, and he was very clear on that, how complex it is. But you can't keep saying it's complex and then not deal with it in a coherent way. And I hope they are very clear on that. But like Phil, I was very impressed with Steve Reed's grasp of some of the issues around nature and food and fairness. There was a clear desire to build fairness into the supply chains, which we can't really sort much of this out unless farmers are getting a decent deal from the marketplace and getting treated fairly. So that's good to see as well. And I did go to a Treasury event talking about a green Treasury, and I made the point that you've got to get them thinking beyond just kilowatts per hours and energy, and into the complex nature of natural systems, and having a nature-based treasury policy, not just energy. And that's difficult, but I hope they absorb that, and we'll go forward thinking about that. But overall, pretty exciting in a way, I think.
Yeah, a change feels like it's long overdue, doesn't it? And I wonder, I mean, probably now, before we'll come on to some of those issues in a bit more detail in due course. But before we go any further, maybe we should reflect at least briefly on the big decision of the previous week when the Conservatives decided to axe the Birmingham to Manchester leg of HS2. Vicki, what did you make of that decision?
Well, there were so many problems with HS2, sort of from a wildlife perspective. It was destroying some extremely important wildlife sites. And so, you've got mixed feelings, because we're all for public and mass transport. Mass transit is absolutely the future. We can't keep getting into very heavy boxes and moving around the country, but it's difficult to square the whole need for better mass transit and capacity with trashing the environment and trashing nature, with a completely muddled and massively overspend on HS2. What a disastrous project it's been, when it could have been a really positive approach to public transport, and it should have been.
It's interesting, isn't it? It always seemed to me that HS2 was an answer to a question that was asked 15 years ago, and it never quite made sense 15 years ago, and it certainly didn't seem to make sense anymore. And for myself, I live in rural Dorset, and going up to London now is an absolute nightmare. Where when I lived in Scotland, it was so easy, and it wasn't the time that it took. The time on the train was no problem at all. It was being able to use that time, that the trains were big enough to be able to sit down and have some space on the table.
It's capacity.
An electricity socket. So 20 minutes off the journey seems neither here nor there, when actually it's being able to use that extra 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Phil, did you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would agree with everything Vicki says. The principle of the project in terms of increasing that capacity and enabling, I suppose, more rail travel in general. So I was looking this morning, and we've now got 1.7 billion rail journeys per year, which is a double compared to 30 years ago. So there's real pressure and strain on the system. So in principle, this project could have been a solution to much of that, and could have been very important in terms of addressing the climate emergency. But the implementation and delivery of it, I suppose, has let us down, and we've seen a lot of issues in terms of wildlife and various different other things. And I think it's a bit of a microcosm of some of the potential tricky issues we've got coming down the line with land use and various different other things, and maybe some lessons to learn.
Do you think that Labour is likely to reverse that decision, or do you think that's an end of it now, either of you?
I think they're a bit screwed, to put it mildly, because the land is now being sold off. It's creating a really big problem for them. What an awful thing to inherit, and they'll have to make some difficult decisions, but hopefully they'll make the right ones in the interests of both nature, environment, and people getting around, and local decisions, local democracy about what transport systems are needed. I mean, some of the mayoral approaches to sort of taking back bus routes in hand is really exciting, because really reflecting what they need to do in terms of controlling mass transit in urban areas as well, which is important for greenhouse gas emissions, etc.
But again, that's sort of local or sort of more regional transport, rather than necessarily those main conduits between big cities. Now, turning back to the Labour conference, the party clearly has big plans, and well, many of them involve the countryside. So 300,000 new homes every year, new towns, a clean and renewable UK electricity grid by 2030. So there's going to be an awful lot going on. And one of the challenges that we face perennially in the UK is that whenever people want to build anything, there's invariably local opposition. And Labour have said that they will create a body, as they did last time they were in power with renewable electricity, that will centralise decisions on major nationally important infrastructure and effectively take it out of the hands of local people. How do you feel about all of that, Phil?
I suppose at face value, it's uncomfortable in terms of what the implications of that could be. You can see the rationale in terms of trying to push through and deliver projects which should contribute towards national prosperity and some of our big objectives. But yeah, there's all sorts of kind of hazard within that as well. And I suppose some of Keir's framing within it was quite interesting. The idea of bulldozing through planning and yeah, kind of this gung-ho attitude. And I think that raises a lot of questions in terms of what the implications would be at a local level for nature, various different other things. And we've seen, I suppose, lots of conversations around the need to liberalise planning, the need to kind of reform the system. And quite often that risks deregulation, which doesn't necessarily result in the delivery of the outcomes we want to see. So I think we need a better system, and I think the focus should be on that as opposed to actually a free-for-all. And the detail isn't there, but I think the framing around that, it brings a bit of risk. I think in terms of the body and I suppose the large-scale infrastructure projects and the risks to, I suppose, local communities, I think there's a real question in terms of what these projects, if there is an impact at a local level, what do you do to overcome that? And what do you do to try and improve community cohesion or any other outcome that they see as valuable?
It's interesting, isn't it? Sort of, looking back to the early 2000s, where, it was very difficult for people to get a wind farm through planning, for example. And then when this National Infrastructure Committee was brought in and was able to take those decisions centrally, if they felt that the wrong decision had been made, at a local planning authority level, we did start to see a big expansion in renewables. And I think, looking back, most people who now live alongside a wind farm that they were concerned about have kind of felt that actually they were worried about the impact, but the impact is much less than they expected, and they're quite happy about it. And we do face a climate emergency as well as various other social emergencies. So isn't there a need for something like this, Phil?
I think in principle, yes, to deliver what we want and what we need. But I think there's still a role to play in trying to bring people along with you as well. And I think that is either compensatory or is through a process of kind of more robust engagement once decisions been made as well, so that people feel that they are not being left behind or something is being enforced on them. I think that will be key. So we talk about a just transition, we talk about support for the net zero transition as well. And I think with the debate at the moment and some of the decisions that have been made recently, they've capitalised potentially on concerns. So I think there's a bit of a balancing act to play within all of those.
Vicki, Phil just mentioned compensation, and that was something that Keir Starmer mentioned as well, wasn't it? The idea that there would be lower energy bills for people who were affected by this sort of infrastructure in their backyard. And he said that he wanted, well, he didn't use the word NIMBY. He didn't say that he wanted to get around NIMBYs, but he did refer to himself as a YIMBY. Well,
yes,
would you call yourself a YIMBY?
Well, I live in Hackney, so there's very little space for anything new. But we've got some fantastic car pollution reduction programs, which maybe makes me a YIMBY in that I think, yes, air pollution, huge problem. Look, I think there's big issues here which should be tackled through a land use framework as well, because we are facing climate crisis. It's already on many parts of the world, and we've got to decarbonize our energy system. But there are ways of doing that are really good and efficient, and low land take as well. Even the idea of solar panels on farms, it's a tiny take, and you can grow food, you can graze animals in a solar system, whereas compared to, for instance, energy crops, which have a huge land take and very little energy from them per hectare. So, those kind of decisions need to possibly be made on a national level. But again, contrast to that, I would say planning system is democracy in action. People should have a say. And, it's a very dangerous route you go around if it's coming from the top down. It will go badly for you.
Yeah.
But I think you could do both. And we've got local nature recovery strategies being developed now with statutory obligations under the Environment Act that should really be part of this picture, as well as the land use framework, as well as the national targets. So it's a lot going on, as you say, Finlo, and more people involved, the better. And having that conversation really needs to happen at local as well as national level.
I guess one of the ways of dealing with this, and this is something that sort of happened with housing more generally in the past, is that local authorities have required, and this happened at a national scale, didn't it, under David Cameron, that there was a requirement for local authorities to zone areas for building, and so there was a big conversation that took place at community level. Once those areas had been zoned, then it was much easier to get planning permission in those areas. But I mean, sort of coming back to that whole housing thing, Simon Jenkins in The Guardian this morning referred to the idea of new towns, the idea of this sort of major build as being, an HS2 for housing. It's a lot of building, and it feels like there could be a really major impact on the countryside if it's done in the wrong way.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And talk of the green belt, being used and those kind of things. We've got to make sure we can grow enough food for ourselves. But obviously, we waste a lot of the land in terms of what we do grow and feeding it to cars or wasting it. We waste 30% of food. So there's lots of questions around that. But in terms of putting housing on, for instance, grade 1 land, really top grade land is a major problem if we're going down that road, and zoning should avoid that. If they should actually be thinking about this in the round in terms of what the land's for. But there are ways that you can do good housing, and it should be social housing as well, because that's one of the biggest problem areas, particularly in rural areas. People on low incomes have nowhere to live, and we need people to be in rural areas to do the farming and new entrants. Labour have really strong statements on new entrants. Where are those new entrants going to live if they've got no housing? So yeah, it's a tricky one, but we need to protect nature as well and restore nature in many areas. So it's a hard and a political choice to be made.
Yeah, and thinking of political choices, Vicki, I wanted to ask you about, the politics behind this. And, over the last sort of 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, I think there has been a rising disaffection amongst perhaps, Labour's sort of core support, the white working class, if you like, that has sort of existed and worked in professions that were largely unionised. And it was clear that the Labour Party was supporting them. And as those professions have changed, as the unions in many ways have become less powerful and responsible for fewer people in less jobs, there has been this rising disaffection that arguably led to Brexit. And I think groups like Blue Labour, for example, Maurice Glassman's group, they have been calling for this re-injection of fairness, for an attention to the working classes, to those those white working classes in particular that have been sort of crying out and moving to nationalist parties and UKIP and so on, to try and get them back on side. And it feels to me that this approach to housing, that this sort of approach around jobs and net zero, Great British Energy, is all part of that same political thrust. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I think you're right. It's a desire to bring those back into the fold, and the whole focus on energy and jobs and innovation is part of that. I mean, we've got to get it right in so many ways, particularly in rural areas, for rural communities and those, as you say, jobs that have changed and the sectors that have changed. And I think they are trying very hard to reach out to those. But from my perspective, what we need is a really strong focus on the kind of jobs that really work in the rural areas and peri-urban areas, enterprise, new enterprise, agroecological food production, also conservation jobs, people working. There's thousands of jobs out there for people for, looking after natural sites, access for them and growing the trees, looking after nature. There's thousands of jobs going there, which we should be talking about, as well as jobs in energy and innovation, which could really be suitable for people who are looking for that kind of work.
And Phil, I just want to ask you about that jobs in the countryside element.
Mm.
You know, the last podcast, the Farmgate podcast, as opposed to an 8.9 Newsweek podcast that we put out, was with Trepenna, with the farm up in Cumbria, where you know, they've moved from an intensive 365 dairy, where they're trying to produce, you know, stay on that dairy treadmill, producing 10,000 litres a year, where they were employing, I think, 2 people on the farm. Now they've gone regenerative. They've integrated agroecological systems. They are trying to keep the cows outside ultimately all year round, but they're out for 10 months of the year now, producing less milk, but providing employment for 16 families they're supporting there now. So there are jobs to be created in the countryside. Do you think that there is a sense among the Labour hierarchy that they understand that there are jobs to be won there, and therefore potentially votes to be won?
Not quite yet, is my answer on that one. I think they get within the net zero transition and the just transition the opportunity for new skills, new investment in clean energy and technology, all those sorts of things. I think there's maybe a little bit of an oversight in terms of the agroecological transition and the contribution that can make to wealth creation and more jobs in local areas. I think it's a Costain report which looked at different farming systems, and I suppose local food systems on average have a lot more employment, I suppose, per capita than I suppose intensive kind of output commodity driven systems. We've also seen that you can have increases in employment if you're looking at natural capital restoration, peatland restoration, all those sorts of things compared to conventional land management. So I think it's emphasizing that. I think within this skills platform and I suppose the investment in skills, that's a bit of a gap as well, which Labour should really be investing in and looking at, which would deliver massive benefits. I don't think they quite see the scale of the opportunity as yet, and that's a job for us to really put out there.
Indeed, and a job for 8.9 as well, to start, you know, to really sort of show that these employment opportunities exist, and to record and to emphasise them. Let's come on to farm payments and on to global trade. So arguably the good intentions of the Conservatives' CAP reforms in England have been greatly undermined by a lack of clarity and a lack of funding. Now, Wales, which is currently run by Labour, and now Scotland, run by the SNP, seem to be heading towards a whole farm payments situation with conditions. But the possibility in Scotland, at least, of extra cash. Now, Vicki, if Labour are elected in England, what changes do you think that we're likely to see? Will they scrap sustainable farming incentive, for example? And importantly, bearing in mind that farmers currently get an incredibly small amount of money in national budgetary terms. What about the cash? And then perhaps we can come back to trade, but let's start with farm payments and farm policy.
At the conference, both Steve Reed and Daniel emphasised that they're not going to scrap the ELMS structure in England immediately. You know, they do not want that disruption forced on farmers when it's been 6 years of uncertainty and disruption and lack of clarity, as you say. So they're both going to stick with it, but they are going to review it and look at how they could do it better, they said. They didn't, unfortunately, although we did press them, promise more budget, which we've identified. You know, a lot of organisations have identified we need more budget. There's no question to just deliver on our statutory duties under net zero and the Environment Act and targets for nature recovery 30% by 2030. All those will need money to provide the incentives, which can't be provided by the market. And we've identified 4.4 billion is needed as a minimum. And you know what we have now is possibly around 3 billion. You know, who knows what that's being spent right now, because it's very hard to tell with this government. So I can understand why they're not making promises when they can't actually get information about what's available now. But it was good to see the Liberal Democrats offer an extra 1 billion. So it would have been nice to see Labour say something about that, because it's absolutely clear that we need to be paying for these public goods and for the transition and for advice and demonstration and training for farmers, because this is a major change. How to adapt to climate change, how to use nature on your farm in ways which save you money ultimately, but in the first few years will be, you know, potentially harmful. So harmful to your bottom line or your yields. You know, you need to have that confidence through training and demonstration with other farmers.
Or a way of adding value.
Exactly. There's so much there and so much positive outcomes from this. And this must be also in the horticulture sector, which I would like to just mention, because, we've got a massive deficit in horticulture. We're importing, nearly 80% of our fruit, 50% of our vegetables, and we could be doing so much more. It's not a huge land take. It can be done in agroecological ways with low inputs, and particularly in the peri-urban sphere, which we were talking about. So if the UK new UK government really had a strategy for horticulture, which the Labour Party did announce they will do, which is great, alongside the land use round, because this government has ditched their horticulture strategy. What we do need is a horticulture strategy links up production, supply chain, and consumption really well, and that's absolutely essential. So we get the benefit for our health, and farmers can, gain from that, because it's a high value crop. So there's lots of things that need to happen, but elms is sort of safe for now, but needs to be reviewed definitely.
Now, Phil, I mean, often, we talk about the way in which regenerative agriculture can increase profitability, increase productivity, even though people need to understand and work their way through that transition. But on the other side, as a result of, the changes that have been taking place and the lack of clarity over the last couple of years, there are an awful lot of farmers that I hear about who are, seriously expecting that they really won't be getting subsidy or payments, at the level that's necessary to keep them in business. And so there is this real sort of push towards kind of doubling down and just trying to produce as much as possible out of the land with the money that's available. And we really do need, as a society, if we want these public goods, if we want ecological security, then society through government needs to pay for them. And, there's no question that even if we multiplied the amount of money that farmers are getting currently by 3, there'd still be change left over in terms of the amount of money that it costs simply to administer central government. I think that costs 11 odd billion, and farming gets 3, possibly 4 billion. So we need to pay for it. And what do you see as the key things that Labour needs to consider?
One of the key things, just going back to the structure around elms and I suppose SFI, everything else on top of that, and that being maintained. One of the things that did kind of intrigued me and popped out within our session was the reference to social outcomes from land management and the agriculture budget in supporting that. And I suppose reading it one of 2 ways, you could see that potentially as the return to an area-based payment to try and deliver some of those social outcomes and maintain incomes, which we wouldn't agree with. Or it could be more sophisticated funding to actually deliver more rural development priorities. So investment in shorter supply chains, investment in other sorts of economic activities which can also contribute towards that prosperity. And I think that's something that Labour should be looking at as a means to complementing the agriculture transition, is that wider rural development and investment in local economies. I think in terms of the budgetary question, we're going to need to see a mix of different funding pots to kind of deliver this sort of stuff. And there was quite a lot of rhetoric around obviously making polluters pay. So how do you make polluting industries pay for I suppose the damage they've caused, or to compensate for that? And we've seen, I suppose, a lack of certainty or rollbacks in the risk of those, I suppose, in nutrient neutrality, biodiversity net gain. And I think those are 2 key mechanisms that I suppose could help support the transition if they're well funded, I suppose, and well regulated as well.
Yeah.
We've obviously got the private market too. It's going to have to play a key role. And there was quite a lot of I suppose conversation in the round how that contributes towards meeting Labour's priorities. And I think obviously within farming and land use, that's going to be crucial. We also need to see that the idea of fairness rolled out more effectively as well, and making sure that farmers are actually getting fair return for the private goods that they produce as well. And that was a key theme within our session. So how do we get that supply chain, that fairness into play as well? And then the last thing thinking about it was just that link, and I mentioned it before, between Labour's big investment and big pledges on climate and moving towards a net zero society. We can't do that without land use, and there's 28 billion pounds that have been committed in that side of things. So can agriculture get a little bit of that pot to deliver all these sorts of things together?
Just a little bit, and even beyond that, let's not undermine agriculture by having trade deals that allow in lower standards. So let's move on to trade deals. We published today on 8.9 a letter from Mary Gudgeon, the Rural Affairs Minister up in Scotland, down to Therese Coffey in Westminster, pointing out that this potential US-UK trade deal is a big concern. We certainly don't want to see hormone injected beef coming into the UK or anything else, the chlorine washed chicken, all kinds of other things. And although those are probably off the table, there are lots of other things in the USA which are lower than UK standards. And there is a great concern that in the rush for trade deals, we'll just give away the kitchen sink. Vicki, you've worked a lot on this issue.
Yeah, it's been, I mean, what has been amazing is the amazing coalition that's built around a campaign to make sure we have core standards in these trade deals. I was working with NFU, Compassion World Farming, all those that might be disagreeing in other ways, but come together, say, absolutely, we must not undermine the good stuff we are doing and could do in the future on environment, on animal welfare, on public health, and on workers, indeed, by letting trade deals undermine those products, by bringing in cheaper products. And yet they are, the trade deals that we've done so far, the CPTPP partnership, which is a huge partnership, potentially is going to undermine that. And a US deal, as you say, there's lots of risks there, on pesticide standards, pesticides allowed. So these countries allow pesticides that are banned here, and residue levels in food. We should not be exposing particularly our children to levels which are potentially harmful, and all this.
And even organic standards are different, aren't they?
Yeah,
US.
they are, and you really want to protect farmers here. What was good about Labour? They said they were going to emphasise local and environmental food in public procurement to 50% of public procurement, which is good. I mean, this government has said the same thing and hasn't done it. Next government needs to really do that, and they've, through the public procurement for schools and hospitals, really support those farmers and not get cheap meat from Australia or America or Canada. So all these things, and it was sort of summarised.
Scotland's better at that, isn't it?
Yeah,
there are models where this has been successful.
Absolutely, and Wales as well. There's some good stuff going on in Wales. Amazing stuff on horticulture, using local horticulture in school meals. Getting it a few hours after it's been picked. How exciting is that? We should be doing that here. But it was kind of summed up by Rees Mogg's comment about having wanting to have hormone injected cheap beef from Australia, and that his local constituency farmers are all up in arms and got a letter into Farmers Weekly, supported by Costain, to actually say this isn't what your constituents want, your farmer, absolutely awful. And Theresa Coffey was talking about bendy bananas, so Europe's sort of insisting that we straighten our bananas. Total nonsense. And what was also interesting about Labour is they focused very much in their trade discussions on Europe and our trade deal with Europe, and aligning of standards and those kind of things, and trying to make sure that there was less friction between the UK and Europe for UK farmers, so they could sell there to our nearest and biggest market. That actually makes a lot of sense, and they were talking a lot of sense in that way. They didn't talk so much about core standards in global trade deals because they're stuck with these deals. So if they're going to inherit them, they can't do enough about them, but they can do a lot with Europe, I think, that could be useful.
It's funny, isn't it? If only there was a way of having frictionless trade with Europe. I can't imagine a situation where that would occur.
Exactly.
And I guess the other thing to sort of pick up on from there, as a sort of lesson perhaps for Labour in England, is to look very closely at what's happening in Wales and Scotland, because there is some really good stuff happening in those other nations. Look, I want to move on to the last topic that I want to touch on, which is the new right to roam in England, overland and up and down waterways. And the right to roam overland, of course, already exists for areas over 1,000 feet in England, but the intention is to extend that to the whole country and to waterways, which are hugely inaccessible at the moment as well. So it's worth mentioning that the right to roam overland already exists in Scotland. So this isn't a new thing, and there's clearly a model that can be followed there. So the question is this a good thing? And if so, how do we balance the needs of the public and the concerns of landowners and land managers? Phil, can I come to you first?
Yeah, and I suppose when we look at it, the level of access that the public has to nature and to the countryside is quite significantly limited. I think it's around 92% of I suppose of land is not accessible. And we know, for example, the range of different benefits that access to nature delivers in terms of health and well-being. So that can make quite a significant impact in terms of, yeah, when you look at it, the growth agenda. So if people are happier, healthier, that's going to resonate in terms of productivity improvements, all sorts of things which are a big focus of Labour. There's obviously questions and quite a lot of concern in terms of what that means for farm businesses and those working in the countryside as well, and implications for food production, potentially implications for nature as well, which I think have to be carefully managed. I think one of the things, the perception of right to roam, is that it's carte blanche access to the countryside and you can do exactly what you want when you want, and that's not the case. There's a strict code that's associated with it, and that needs to be upheld. But I think there needs to be increased responsibility across both sides. I think it's something that there's a lot more conversation needed on it. I think a lot more of, not necessarily a debate, but how does this work practically? Yeah. And I think one of the key things within this as well is this is obviously a form of public goods access. How do we lever in the support and the funding to improve that access as well, so that costs are evenly spread, or if there is a cost associated with that, that's covered.
Now, Phil mentioned there that sort of code that needs to be in place. And of course, you know, I describe it as right to roam because that's how people sort of think about it and understand it. But in Scotland, it isn't just a carte blanche right to roam. There is a code that people are expected to apply. But of course, you know, the whole right to roam notion in Scotland comes from the fact that, particularly in the lowlands, there are very few public rights of way. In England, there are a lot of public rights of way, which means that you therefore have the opportunity to access that land in the first place, and then potentially roam away from it to look at nature or to have a picnic or whatever else it is. And so there is this really big opportunity in England. What do you think, Vicki? What are the challenges here?
I think there's absolutely no doubt at all that we need more access to nature for the population, as Phil said, you know, just purely in terms of well-being, but also the economy. We know the evidence is clear. The Wildlife Trust have just released a report about the billions that can be saved to the Treasury by getting people access to nature. So it really can do a lot. And I think one of the key things is to manage it and to ensure, as Phil's saying, that there is funds available for farmers and landowners to do the right kind of infrastructure for that. You know, there's proper signage, safe fencing, all that kind of thing, and engagement to allow sorry, it's my cat. Engagement in that in the food growing itself. You know, we've been talking about this for 6 years as part of ELMS. I don't think we've got anything yet. You know, to help farmers get the public engaged in the practice of farming, understanding where food comes from. Particularly useful in horticulture. Obviously, you can do that quite well. But it can be in other farming systems as well. So we should be providing that support because it's a public good. But responsible access was the phrase I heard a lot in Labour, and Steve Reid certainly talked about that. Very clear in sense that it needs to be responsible, well managed, and codes adhered to, and that is increasingly the case, particularly with regard to picnics and forest fires and things like that, which are going to be more frequent. So we need to have the right kind of forests that aren't sitka spruce and very flammable, but we also need the right kind of access and codes and enforcement of that codes, if I can use that word.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, you know, an awful lot of farmers I know are concerned about this. They're sort of focused on the challenges rather than the opportunities. But it seems to me that there is an enormous opportunity here. We're talking about the way in which, you know, agriculture and funding land use needs more money. And for that, it needs people in suburban areas, in urban areas, and frankly, a lot of people in the countryside to better understand what farming is about, how land use works, some of those challenges. And so the opportunity for better engagement here seems to me to be, you know, really key in this, and to sort of break down that idea that, you know, exists, that, you know, farmers just say, get off my land, and people do that. And one of the other elements that comes into it is diversity. You know, I know that, you know, when I've done podcasts in the past about racism in the UK and whether how the level to which that exists in the countryside. One of the comments that's been made is that a lot of ethnic minority communities simply don't know what to do when they come into the countryside. They're not quite sure what the rules are, and they're worried about doing something that that will go down badly. And so there's a way of codifying this, of having a public awareness campaign, having that responsible access. That seems to me that it can only be good, Vicky.
Absolutely, and it is happening. You see a lot of groups getting together to be more comfortable into going to the countryside as groups for walking groups, for instance, for various ethnic groups. But you also got to think about disability as well, access for people alone. And again, this is something the Wildlife Trust are acutely aware of and are doing. They're spending a lot of time looking at making sure access to the natural spaces they're responsible for, which includes a lot of farmland, are accessible in the right way. But that it's interesting to think about how you could build that into education and communication tools that the government has, and at local level, local authorities could be really doing this well. But yes, to have the right to have that support and funding, farmers and landowners need to have the public on their side and to see what's being delivered, so they can talk about the wonderful nature that they're delivering, the clean water that they're delivering, the birds and the bees and the water voles, etc. And being able to see that will give them that. Flood prevention, exactly. There's a really great story to be told, and it can be done through local media as well, local authorities, in schools, getting schools on site. Again, you need the support to have the right kind of hand washing equipment, etc. So there's a lot of really positive things there, and it also combines with the potential jobs, as Phil was talking about, in restoration of nature in the countryside. Alex Sobel is a Labour MP who used to be a shadow minister, and he was really keen on this. So hopefully there's some strong support within Labour.
Yeah, and of course there's Open Farm Sunday as well, and it's another opportunity to bring people out and to educate them on how the new rules might work, and to have that conversation, engage countryside users with farmers, people who enjoy the countryside but don't necessarily talk to farmers on a regular basis. Look, I want to give you both just a quick chance to wrap up, and Phil, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but if you could just sort of any final comments that you have on this subject, but then sort of thoughts overall, that would be fantastic. But so I'm going to come to you in just a second, but Vicky, any final thoughts from you?
I think I was quite interested to see emphasis on diversity of farming, and that kind of links in with what we've just been talking about as well, having diversity of farming, diversity of opportunities, small, medium and large, in the Labour documents and statements, and cooperatives. More farmers getting into cooperatives, either for buying or for selling. Absolutely the way to go, to have more strength against the extremely concentrated and powerful buyers that they're up against. So that was exciting, but also new entrants. They mentioned new entrants and giving support to new entrants. That will provide more diversity, young people, creativity into the farming community, which it needs. It's getting aged. It needs more people coming, and that is happening. So there were some really positive things that I read in what they're proposing, which I think we really need to hold them to if they get into power, and provide the resources.
Thank you very much. Phil?
Yeah, for me, one of the key things that came out was that kind of split in terms of different investment, and looking at subsidy from a point of view of being palliative or being productive. And I think for us as a movement, it's really trying to demonstrate that investment in land management, investment in food is a productive investment and isn't one that's trying to overcome issues that society is facing. So I think whether that's free school meals, for example, or investment in land management, these are all things that directly contribute towards Labour's agenda. And I think that's something that we really have to emphasise.
Right. Thank you both. I think we've been talking for a long time, and we better stop. I know there are so many other issues that we could have touched on, but they'll just have to wait for some other conversations that I'm sure we'll have in the future. So for now, I'd like to thank Vicky Hurd and Phil Carson. That's all for now. We're back soon.